Good
Good
evening,
evening.
everyone. Good evening, everyone. This is a very, very significant topic, namely the world balance of power. There has been a great deal of literature on this issue ever since the disintegration of the Soviet bloc in 1990-91. And of course, the fact that simultaneously China became increasingly integrated into the capitalist world economy, and President Bush promulgated, George W. Bush, that is, who was president 89 to 93, January 93. Promulgated the New World Order, in which there was a single country, namely the United States, that was the only superpower remaining. Most people understand the issue of the global balance of power, especially in the West, in terms of the old Cold War paradigm. And that is, there were two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was more of a superpower in the military sense because it had enormous numbers of nuclear warheads, whereas the United States was a superpower both in the military and economic sense. What I want to do today, this is part one of a two-part session, is discuss the shifting global balance of power from the transatlantic core of Northwest Europe and the United States, of course, the G7 collectively, if you will, which includes, of course, Japan, to China. And gradually, as we move forward, projections are that India will not be far behind in 3-4 decades' time from now. The issue of the global balance of power and the shift in the global balance of power is very important. Although most people don't think about it, it's very important because it has an impact in living standards, not just in the countries that are declining, like the West is declining, and we see poverty rates and inequality rising in Western countries, including the United States. But it's also significant because the countries that had enjoyed superpower status, namely the United States, which had enjoyed superpower status since the Truman administration and is now gradually declining, poses a sense of anxiety on a world scale, because countries usually in situations such as that, in gradual decline, tend to become overly anxious with using the military, using the defense sector as as leverage to retain global power. So this is, of course, manifested today in Ukraine, in the war, in this protracted war going on the third year, which is essentially a war that Russia did start, by the way. Let's not have any confusion about that. Russia did invade Ukraine. However, it was provoked by the NATO group, the US-led NATO group, which endeavored, and it still does, to retain the Western hegemony over the globe, especially the global South, and at the same time prevent the rapid rise of expanding NATO. NATO has made no secret of its plans to expand anywhere it wishes. Although NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it is now the new definition of Western or transatlantic national security in order to retain global hegemony. Is the new definition is that anywhere in the world where Western interests are at stake, NATO has the right to expand. Therein rests the clash between the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin, which, by the way, wants to restore at least some of its former glory when it was once a superpower itself. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, of course, the United States-led NATO group, which endeavors to expand into, from Ukraine into the Black Sea. By the way, the Crimea is the most important region there, and into the Trans-Caucasus region and on to Central Asia as a means of containing the next superpower, namely China, at this point economic superpower, but as we will see, economic superpowers very quickly become military superpowers. I also want to point out, by way of introduction, that the global shift in the balance of power, the twilight of the West, as the title indicates, and the rise of Asia with China at the core of Asia, has had an impact not just in terms of the US and NATO engaging in military adventures, which could be conflicts which could be solved. They could still be solved, and they will be solved, by the way, because there is no other way, through diplomatic channels. Conflicts that can be resolved diplomatically are pursued through military means as leverage, and to send a signal to the rising superpower in Asia, namely China, that the US has the resolve with its partners, okay, with its NATO partners and Japan, it has the resolve to use military means to engage in confrontation in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait over Taiwan, using Taiwan as a pretext, of course, to contain China. So this is an important issue from that perspective also. I do want to mention, before I go on into some of the global balance of power concepts and some of the history of it, a recent article in Newsweek by the former Defense Secretary and CIA Director Robert Gates discussed this issue. The article, Newsweek, analyzed the question of superpower status of the United States and its twilight against the background of rising threats. And the United States clearly considers China the most threatening, because China, besides having nuclear weapons, is the #1 country in the world in GDP terms measured in purchasing power parity, not in nominal value. In nominal value, the United States remains the world's #1 economy. But what really matters is purchasing power parity. And in that regard, China is ahead by $5.5 trillion in GDP of the United States. Moreover, no one has any illusions, not Western analysts, not Asian analysts, no one has any illusions that in due course, in a few years, China will be the world's #1 economic power in nominal value as well as purchasing power parity value, which it already is today. The prospect of the United States losing its superpower status has resulted in destabilization in the Middle East, as well as in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, and this as well as in the South China Sea, with the United States using the Philippines, its former colony, and agitating in the South China Sea, where it insists that its only interest is the national sovereignty of Taiwan, and it has no other interest other than supporting the democratic rights of Taiwan and the national sovereignty of Taiwan and its freedom against China that wants to take it over, to absorb it. China has made no secret. In fact, the US had to agree to the One China policy before normalizing relations. This was one of the preconditions. China has made no secret that Taiwan is part of the China mainland. This is the official position of China. Now, having said that, I want to talk about the various factors that go into superpower relations and balance of power relations, I should say, and give you, first of all, a little bit of history, how this came about. The idea of an international balance of power is a European concept, and it came out of the 17th century. The Europeans had a 30-year war. It's called, in fact, the 30 Years' War, which ended with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. That 30-year war was a very bloody, devastating, destructive war, accompanied by famine and disease. Many Europeans lost their lives, and essentially the two sides were the Habsburg Empire. We commonly call it Austria today, but it was obviously much larger than modern-day Austria, which is very small, which was Catholic, and allied with Spain, also Catholic. So it was these two Catholic countries against predominantly, but not exclusively, the Protestant Northwest European countries. However, France was on the side of the Protestants. This war ended with the Europeans agreeing that no country should have too much power because it destabilizes everybody else. This is in the absence of an international organization like a League of Nations and the United Nations. Not that the League of Nations was effective at all, by the way. Not that the United Nations is effective. But the idea was indeed for the powers to put constraints on themselves. And they felt that if any one of them became too powerful, it became a threat to the others. So the idea of a balance of power, equilibrium, in other words, diplomatic equilibrium, political equilibrium, not diplomatic, political equilibrium, was important, and it was to the benefit of everyone to agree to equilibrium, to agree that these countries should put restraints on themselves. I should point out, by the way, that Henry Kissinger, who was influenced by the Austrian foreign minister of the early 19th century, Clement von Metternich, was influenced by this concept, the concept that powers, the great powers, this was before there were superpowers, should put restraints on themselves because they pose a threat to the others and eventually it comes back to them. In fact, one of the things that Kissinger said when the Soviet Union collapsed was that the United States had to determine to what degree it was going to contain itself, to restrain itself. Unrestrained power in the world arena is very dangerous, and it results in bloody wars like, as I pointed out, the 30 Years' War that resulted in the Peace of Westphalia, where the Europeans came to the realization that the madness has to stop and there has to be equilibrium, and that structurally the way the madness would stop is for a balance of power. Hence the concept world balance of power. That's the origin. The 18th century, out of the French Revolution, comes the idea of a balance of power is revisited because England industrializes very rapidly. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about this in more detail that is essential in the power of the country is technology and industry and technology. Industry and technology drives defense. Even Peter the Great, the Russian Tsar, who was very astute, a very astute leader, but he wasn't exactly a scholarly person. He wasn't well educated, but he understood the connection between technology and industry and then applying all of that to defense. And he understood that technology and industry meant that you must have a strong economy. And so even he, who, he wasn't a Western European leader to be close to the inventions of the 17th century and the science of the 17th century, but he appreciated that. Now, in the 17th century, technology and industry and science advanced. And of course, the Europeans had already applied technology to the defense sector. And Europe, by the 17th century, was already had already colonized much of the what we call today the global South, Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia. In the 17th century, the international balance of power in Europe, not global, but the international balance of power in Europe, was somewhat upset because the Ottoman Empire was weakening very quickly. And the Western Europeans, especially the British and the French, but also the Russians, were looking to make advances to take a chunk out of that, to enter the markets of the Ottoman Empire, and from the Ottoman Empire into the Middle East. So the scheme in the international balance of power in the 17th century was to penetrate much of the Middle East through the weakened Ottoman Empire, as well as the Balkans, by the way. The Ottomans also controlled the entire Balkan region. So the Western Europe's wanted, as well as Russia, to become even stronger by getting geopolitical and geoeconomic control of the Balkan region as well as the Middle East and the Ottoman Empire, namely the Near East. And so that was one dimension. The other was after the revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte becomes emperor. And Napoleon Bonaparte had dreams of glory, conquest, expanding into Russia, expanding into Egypt. France was going to become this major empire. He upset the balance of power that was established during the Westphalian Treaty in 1648. He destabilized all of Europe. The main enemy, although he attacked Russia, and that was certainly an enemy, was actually Britain, because the balance of power pertained not just to land, but also to the high seas. It was both on land as well as the high seas. And Britain, as an island country, always considered itself to have the right to have hegemony at sea. Napoleon did not respect the traditional concept of the balance of power. After he was defeated at Waterloo, there was an attempt to restore the balance of power and to prevent any country from upsetting it. And the architect behind all of this was the Austrian. I mentioned his name before because he was Henry Kissinger's idol. In fact, at Harvard University, Henry Kissinger did his dissertation on the Austrian foreign minister, Prince Metternich. Prince Metternich believed in the balance of power, but he believed in the balance of power not for any idealistic reasons, but rather so that Austria, the Austrian Empire, can preserve itself and not be threatened by any nationalist revolutionaries who wanted to break off. The Austrian Empire, the old Austrian Empire, was made up of various ethnic groups, and Hungarians and so forth, Croats. They all wanted separation. Czechs, Slovaks, okay? So his motivation was the preservation of the Austrian Empire to remain intact. He also contributed another idea, and again, impacting the thought of diplomats like Henry Kissinger, others as well. I'm mentioning Henry Kissinger because everybody knows who he is. He contributed the idea that when you, on a world scale, when you want to resolve a regional issue, you don't go to the small power that has a regional conflict. You deal with the great powers. For example, when Kissinger was Secretary of State, he dealt with the Soviet Union and with the Chinese about Vietnam. He dealt with Vietnam directly. There were negotiations in Paris. Le Ductot and Kissinger did have negotiations, his Vietnamese counterpart. But he believed very strongly that regional conflicts of smaller power, involving smaller powers, are actually resolved by the larger powers. They have hegemony over the smaller ones anyway. That model was maintained. The balance of power concept was restored until the 1890s. Europe did not have major wars. It had smaller wars, imperialist wars. Imperialism upset the balance of power once again. Now, I'm going to pause here and point out that the global players, the dominant powers in the world in the 19th century, were first and foremost Great Britain. Great Britain emerged as the #1 world power You know, the old saying that the sun never sets in Great Britain for a reason, because it had colonies worldwide. Tiny little Britain, this island country, was an imperial power with an immense navy, and it enjoyed hegemony over the global south, but also in Europe. What happens, however, during the Second Industrial Revolution is three new countries industrialize and they become technological players very rapidly, and industry and technology is applied to defense. Those countries were Germany, US, and Japan. All three became great powers. All three also wanted to pursue the same imperialist ambitions of the rest of Northwest Europe. They wanted markets, a market share of the world. If not colonies, like the United States, for example, was very hesitant about directly having colonies, but indirectly semi-colonies and zones of influence or spheres of influence that they did not shy away from. Japan wanted a share of the world market in Asia, increasingly looking at itself as the hegemonic power in Asia. So the global balance of power in Asia was the regional balance of power in Asia on a global scale was to be determined by Japan. Japan industrialized, built a huge navy very quickly. Technologically, it began to compete with the West, and it felt that it had the right to a share of the Asian market, and it did not want, it did not feel that the Europeans should marginalize Japan. In fact, Japan went to war against Russia in 1804, 1805, the Russo-Japanese War, which it won, by the way, over control of northeast of China, namely Manchuria, where Beijing is located. So Japan had that same mindset of determining the regional balance of power in Asia as the United States had about determining the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere from Canada down to Argentina, right? As the Europeans had about determining the balance of power in Africa. The Europeans did not want anyone outside of Europe in Africa. The US didn't want the Europeans in Latin America. Although the Europeans were economically in Latin America, the US went to war against Spain in 1898, defeating Spain, becoming the heir to the Spanish Empire, and pursuing economic integration of Latin America very quickly after that, as well as the Philippine Islands. It took the Philippine Islands as well, by the way, and colonized the Philippine Islands. So the balance of power was determined by what are called core countries. The core countries were Northwest Europe, led by Great Britain, the United States in the Western Hemisphere, and of course Japan in Asia. The question that many historians and people dealing in foreign affairs have asked is, to what degree does technology and industry determine? I worked with a very talented historian in Chicago who had written a very fine work, a very fine book on technology and empire. The thesis of his book was that the reason Europe, US, Japan were able to build an empire for themselves to pursue imperialist policies was because technology permitted it. However, a great power does not become a great power determining the balance of power regionally or globally merely because it is technologically advanced. If that were the case, Finland and Sweden today would be among that group of nations. They would be great power because Finland and Sweden are technologically very advanced countries. It takes other factors. One of those is a very strong economy and a system of alliances and integration of the economy with as many parts of the world as possible. And the ability to determine the terms of trade with trading partners. So the countries that have historically determined the balance of power are what one school of thought, which I sort of subscribe to it. I have, on occasion, I have been known to use the theoretical model of this school of thought, the modern world system school, which implies that the world is divided between very few core countries, which are the most advanced technologically and industrially, and the richest. And then the semi-periphery countries, the countries that are sort of the middlemen between the core countries and the periphery countries, the third world. The concept of third world, by the way, is a Cold War concept. It came out of the Cold War because the transatlantic core countries called themselves the first world. The second was the Soviet bloc, and the third world was the global south. So that term third world comes out of that context. Now, the balance of power was seriously upset in World War I. The Germans, after Bismarck was dismissed as chancellor in 1890 by Kaiser Wilhelm II, the king of Germany, the German Empire, Germany upset the balance of power. Bismarck respected the balance of power. Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian foreign minister who unified Germany, believed that Germany would be safest to impose its hegemony over the continent of Europe as long as it didn't cross the line of trying to be a hegemonic power, a dominant power, both on the continent as well as at sea, and challenge the naval supremacy of Britain. When he tried to explain to the Kaiser, to the King of Germany, the complex system of alliances, which when you study those alliances, when I used to teach diplomatic history, and I explained it to the students, they agreed with the king that they are very contradictory. On the face of them, when you read them, when you read the details, it's boring stuff. But when you look at the alliances, one contradicts the other. But he did it deliberately. He did it deliberately to neutralize Germany's enemies so that Germany can stay dominant, stay strong, and determine the balance of power on the continent, right? When the Kaiser dismissed him, he said, okay, the end of these alliances, these contradictory alliances. And he also crossed the line, the Kaiser crossed the line of wanting Germany to become both a continental power, because he felt Germany, and he was, I guess, in some respect, correct, that Germany was rapidly industrializing, rapidly becoming the number one technological power in Europe and scientific power in Europe. He was enthusiastic about Germany's future. And as Fritz Fischer, the great German scholar, who many decades ago, when I was an undergraduate and I studied his works, argued in one of the works that he published, World Power or Decline. In other words, the Germans of the Kaiser generation in the 1890s, early 1900s believed that Germany had two choices: decline or hegemony on a world scale, determining the balance of power globally. I'm afraid, by the way, the reason I'm mentioning the Fischer thesis, the Fritz Fischer, is because Fritz Fischer believed this not only led to World War I, but he also believed that World War II was a continuation of World War I, which he was right, was an unfinished war, a big mess created during the Treaty of Versailles. In any case, we'll refer to that again. The reason I'm mentioning this and emphasizing it in the sense that I am is because today we have the United States and its NATO junior partners pursuing, not respecting the global balance of power, not realizing that what Henry Kissinger did say when there was the collapse, when the Soviet bloc was about to collapse during the Gorbachev era, when they were negotiating to denuclearize, to bring down the level of the arms race and so forth. Not denuclearize, but to put a pause on the arms race, the nuclear arms race, and so forth, and for Russia to become a more open society, and all of the Soviet bloc, which obviously resulted in the disintegration and the integration of all the republics into the capitalist world economy, including, by the way, Russia. This is important because today, right now, two wars, one in the Middle East, one up in Ukraine, and military agitation in the South China Sea, indicate that the Russian-Chinese proposal of a multipolar world order, not a unipolar one where the US is the single global power, but a multipolar one where power is distributed and the balance of power is respected on the basis of commensurate power based on economic indicators, namely GDP, that this is resisted by the US. The US doesn't want this, and it imposes containment at any cost. This is how we got to Ukraine. The war in the Middle East, which it's not a war, it's a genocide, which is way out of control, by the way. The international community should have never let this happen. The Israeli people have the right to be free and the right to sovereignty and so forth, but not at the expense of the Palestinians, and certainly not to deny the right to national sovereignty for one group doesn't mean you deny it to the next and you engage in genocide. And to have the great powers, namely the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany, four of the biggest countries in the world, as well as Australia, by the way, as well as Japan, support all of this. because they know right now that the biggest economic power in the entire Middle East is China. And that China benefited from the US loss of the war in Afghanistan, as did Iran, by the way, and that China is the one that benefited from the US military occupation in Iraq, and that economically, because China dominates economically the Middle East as well as Africa. The future integration of the Middle East and Africa is with China. It's not with the West. The Africans, people who follow the news about Africa, know that Africans do not want integration. In fact, they want the Westerns out. Many African countries, not all, I want to stress this, but a number of African countries want the West out. South Africa and Nigeria are the two most important ones. Nigeria is still with the West. South Africa is not, by the way. South Africa is with the BRICS group, led by China. And so the reason I mentioned the balance of power, and I paused on this, in World War I, which exploded because Germany didn't respect it. So there was an eventual clash between Germany and Britain because Britain drew the line on Germany crossing over and trying to become dominant at sea. The reason I'm doing, I stopped and I paused and mentioned what's happening today is because scholars in articles and books have talked about the global balance of power after the Cold War resembling what existed before 1914. A multipolar world order. The US, however, is refusing to recognize this reality, although technologically and economically and industrially, there is a shift to Asia, to East Asia, led by China. And China is leading the BRICS group, which a number of countries throughout the global south want to join. They're not rushing to join any Western bloc. They're rushing to join the China-led BRICS group. So that's the reason I pause to make these parallels, because they have been made in scholarly literature, that we are looking at a multipolar world in reality, but refusal on the part of the West, led by the United States, to accept and to recognize this reality. And this brings us to war, utterly destructive wars like in Ukraine, where a third of the population, by the way, is displaced, either internal refugees or they have fled to the rest of Europe. And even worse, the genocide down in Israel, which is out of control, way out of control. And the West is going along with it. To achieve what? No one knows. Secretary of State Blinken is in Beijing, and they told him there has to be an immediate ceasefire. This has to stop. It's beyond madness. It's a tragedy. Okay, I'm going to pause there because I've been talking for 45 minutes before I continue on a little bit, and ask if you, Assad, if you're there, if you have any questions. If not, I'll continue. Okay, I will then continue with the rest of the points that I want to make. When World War I ended, by the way, it was the successor to determining the balance of power on the world scale was the United States. The United States was, without a doubt, the successor to the Western Europeans. It was the core country. Financial power has shifted from London to New York, first of all. Germany was weakened considerably. Italy was weakened, although it was on the winning side in World War I. The US, however, retreated, became isolationist in the interwar period, for which it paid the price. And the world balance of power was upset once again. It was disturbed once again when the Axis powers, 3 countries and their smaller allies, but 3 major countries, Fascist Italy under Benito Mussolini, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler, and Imperial Japan under Emperor Hirohito, these 3 countries all had ambitions for global, regional, and ultimately global hegemony. These 3 countries had ambitions at upsetting the international balance of power through military means. And this was what led to World War II. And World War II obviously was the ultimate devastation of the Western Europeans as well as Japan. And World War II was also what ushered in the Chinese Revolution. It started during the war, by the way. It started in 1943. There was a resistance movement. Chinese, Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai were in the Chinese resistance against the Japanese. But throughout Eastern Europe, even Western Europe, France and Italy, for example, there was a communist resistance. So you have a resistance movement that is global throughout the world during the war in warring countries that is communist, looking to the Soviet Union as the model. And when the war ends, the Soviet Union emerges very powerful because Eastern Europe is divided. It goes into the Soviet bloc. There is the Iron Curtain, the division between East and West. And at the same time, China succeeds in its own revolution. So there's a communist regime there. Although the communist countries were not ever a monolith, right? And then with the Korean War, it was very clear to the West that the communists were aggressive. Although Kim Il-sung was arguing, the leader of North Korea, that the only thing he wanted is unification, but under communism, of course, under communist regime. In any case, what you have is a very strong shift in the world balance of power as a result of World War II. And that shift is from the capitalist countries in Northwest Europe, which become completely paralyzed and are utterly dependent on the United States to revive militarily through NATO and through the Marshall Plan, massive aid poured into Europe to revive them. The US also revived Japan, by the way, South Korea, and Taiwan, those 3 countries in Asia. So the balance of power shift is the US with junior partners, okay, in the superpower of the Western world, economically and militarily, because nuclear weapons come into the picture after World War II. Obviously, the US using the bombs, 2 bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then, of course, there's the Soviet bloc and China on the other side. And they, too, had eventually developed after 1949. They developed nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union and then eventually China also developed nuclear weapons. So the balance of power is between East and West, and it's ideological. On the surface, it seems on the surface that the real issue was the communist way of life or the capitalist way of life, of democracy. Below the surface, actually, there was a struggle for natural resources and markets, for oil, for minerals, for economic strength, because economic strength is the foundation for military strength. Without economic strength, you don't have much chance. Eventually, you will go bankrupt. As many historians, military historians point out, if you look at history, you don't have to go back to the ancient times, just the last 500 years. All the countries that lacked the economic means to remain great powers collapsed because they overspent on defense. If they overspent on defense and lacked the economic means to support the defense sector, the result is collapse. And this is one of the concerns, by the way, today with the United States, which spends more money in defense than the next 11 countries combined, and yet it has a debt, public debt, of 34 trillion, which will accelerate even more in the next 15 years, according to all estimates. And defense absorbs a great deal of capital that could be used to strengthen the civilian sector, which then accounts for a sound economy that can, on which the military, a strong military, can rest. In other words, the economy must be the foundation, not the military. The military just sucks up resources, by the way. It's a parasitic sector. It's true, but that, by the way, I don't want to leave people with the impression that nothing has come out of research and development in the defense sector, because as we know, the computer itself has come out of that. But a lot of innovation has come out of that. But those are small incidental matters. In the larger picture, historically, like I said, I believe Paul Kennedy has written a book on this issue, which traces how the defense sector has literally weakened and contributed to the twilight of great powers, who then had to face the music of decline and a lesser role in the global balance of power. This is a lesson for today as well, given how much emphasis is given by NATO, US-led NATO countries to spending on defense, rather than using resources to strengthen the civilian economy. I want to mention one other point, and then in the next part, because we're up in an hour now, and so I'm going to end it there. The World War II was won by the U.S., and the U.S. becomes the foundation for the Western world order, and then there's the Soviet bloc. It seems that the Soviet bloc, that the communist bloc is one, but actually the Soviet Union and China, Mao and Stalin were not exactly pals. The Soviet Union looked after its own interests. China looked after its own interests. They had divergent interests. Kissinger, by the way, took advantage of that. He understood that. Kissinger, having studied Metternich and having learned a lot from the Austrian master, took advantage of the Sino-Soviet split. in any event, the seeds of the post-war World War II global balance of power are laid during the war, because already during World War II, the Roosevelt administration was laying plans for um, um, a post war world in which the U.S. would be the hegemonic power and determine the balance of power on a world scale. This is the topic that we will be discussing next time. And for now, I thank you, and I would love to hear your comments on this session. Thank you very much.